Well, Richard Tice is the co-chairman of Leave Means Leave, and Ali Renison is head of Europe and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors. So, Richard, Mark Stone making reference there to the fact that the UK's already lost a battle on sequencing. We can't talk about trade negotiations until we've settled the exit bill.
Well, no, not at all. Let's remember the UK wanted to try and agree the position with UK citizens and EU citizens last summer. And actually it was the EU that's being delaying that. That's not a concession at all. You know, the issue of sufficient progress, that will be fudged. The real issue is that actually what needs to happen is they need to accelerate these talks to reduce the uncertainty for both sides. And it's interesting, isn't it, that Michel Barnier also said that actually no deal would not work for either side. I think that's absolutely critical. What I was deeply disappointed about yesterday was Philip Hammond undermining the negotiating position of the United Kingdom by suggesting that no deal would be a very, very bad outcome. It wouldn't. It would be a fine. As a base case, we revert to WTO. If you go into a negotiation not prepared to walk away, you end up like David Cameron with the square root of nothing.
But that's the point, isn't it, Ali? I mean, Theresa May still threatened to walk away, given that we're now effectively in a hung parliament.
I think the threat will still be there, certainly at least implicitly. It was in her Lancaster House speech. It's what a lot of people have paid attention to. But I think there'll be a lot more attention from the UK side, including potentially from the backbenchers of the Conservative Party, focusing on what they want out of a deal. I'm a little bit less sanguine about the idea of walking away without a deal. I don't think a commercial border is necessarily the same thing as negotiating between states. And the reason for that is that there are some things that are known with respect to the WTO. So, for example, tariffs. What isn't covered is what service economies care about, which is preferential regulatory agreements, what governs the single market in effect. The Irish border, you walk away without a deal, you don't really have a solution on the Irish border, and it becomes a much harder border than it would be. So I think that, you know, I think that actually what he said is quite right, actually, is that it's not a concession to be talking about citizens' rights first, but I think the EU has also gotten itself into a little bit of a pickle because it says it wants to talk about the Irish border as one of those three things first. How can you talk about the Irish border without talking about trade arrangements?
Look, I think the Irish border is clearly key. Everybody wants to sort that out. But there are many ways of organising that. You know, there's a soft border between the United States and Canada, for example. Almost $2 billion a day flows over that border. So, you know, that actually is quite easy to resolve. What I'm really keen to see is that actually they agree to accelerate these talks. What we can't have is this sort of 1 week of negotiations a month and then 3 weeks of posturing and media noise and stuff. You know, and this dragging on to March 19. In our view, at Leave Means Leave, they need to say if we haven't reached a free trade deal by the end of March next year, then both sides should accept they're not going to reach that deal and start preparing for WTO and the technical transition arrangements. That's the way that you accelerate certainty for everybody.
Okay, Ali, you mentioned the border with Ireland just now. Do you take any comfort from the fact that the DUP are now involved with the government? Because the DUP, of course, say they don't want the reintroduction of a hard border with the Irish Republic.
I think it certainly will mean that those concerns are even more front and centre, although when you read the DUP's manifesto, it sort of effectively replicates a lot of what the Conservative Party set out in its manifesto, wanting to trade outside of the customs union, for example. I think that actually a lot of us are talking past each other. We see potentially, you know, the end destination of being out of the customs union and out of the single market potentially as a likely reality. The question is how fast do you get, what sort of process do you take to get there? Because I think the issue here is that, you know, as Richard mentioned, yes, there are solutions around the border, but the problem is that when you look at the US-Canadian border, they're not moving back from something that's effectively completely porous and frictionless, and that's where the scope for disruption comes quite easily, and that's why the transition has to be carefully managed, which is not the same thing as letting them go on ad infinitum. It's quite important to remember that actually the EU has said that it wants a time-limited transition, so it's not as if the EU is trying to say to the UK, let's have an open-ended position where you never actually leave.
Yeah.
But interestingly, it's organisations like the CBI that are saying we need a long transition. We don't. We need to accelerate the process. Once you've agreed heads of terms, essentially, just like in business, you put it in the hands of the lawyers and you accept that basically a deal is agreed in principle, everyone knows where they stand, and that must be accelerated.
So do you think there's a need for a transitional agreement?
Well, I don't speak for the CBI, I represent the Institute of Directors, but obviously we see the need for transition, but I think that Richard is right when he says that at a certain point, the entire free trade agreement, sort of details sewn up in one bag, will not be done if the EU continues to insist on this kind of separation between the sequencing. So they're going to have to deem that sufficient progress is made much earlier on, potentially, than they thought. But I think as long as the transition is time limited, that's something something that we see from our members' point of view. Over 80% of them think this is extremely important for their business, but it has to be an orderly, time-limited transition.
I mean, this is the risk, Richard, isn't it, when Barnier has more or less admitted that we may not even start talking about trade until October. I mean, that's completely unsatisfactory, isn't it?
It's completely unacceptable. It wouldn't happen in business. And this is actually, you know, at the end of the day, this is about the economies of the EU 27 and our economies. And so that must be accelerated. In my view, and our view at Leave Means Leave, you know, David Davis, he has got to try and get the EU to agree to accelerate this. It's in everybody's interest. The EU has significant other issues out there. It's in their interest to accelerate this in the same way that it's in our interest.
What about Ali's points that while WTO terms may be perfectly acceptable for manufacturers, in services it's a whole different ballgame?
Well, you say that, but actually there are no tariffs on services. And actually, frankly, most businesses would much rather our own sensible, well-regulated regulatory environment than relying on the EU regulations. I think that is a key win. That's one of the great benefits of Brexit, that we can start to deregulate and have sensible regulation.